Billy Thornfield's camera trembled in his weathered hands, the telephoto lens capturing something that shouldn't exist in the Cherokee National Forest. An 800-pound grizzly bear lying motionless beside Crying Creek, its massive chest rising and falling in labored breaths. The bear wasn't dead, but it wasn't moving either, just staring at Billy with eyes that seemed almost human. It wasn't injured from a fall or a fight. Metallic fragments glinted from between its massive jaws like broken teeth. Mary Strongbear dropped her veterinary kit when she saw the X-ray images an hour later, medical instruments scattering across the forest floor with sharp metallic clanks. Joe Whitehorse, the old Cherokee elder, pressed his palm against his chest and whispered a prayer his grandfather had taught him 70 years ago. This was the same spot where Joe's son Tobias had vanished 30 years ago, leaving nothing behind but footprints that ended at the water's edge. "Get the surgical team here now," Mary commanded, though her voice cracked with the weight of something she couldn't yet name. What secrets had this gentle giant been carrying in its belly for 3 decades, and why did it choose today to finally come home? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning mist clung to the Cherokee National Forest like the breath of sleeping ancestors, and Joseph Joe Whitehorse knew something was calling him home. At 68, the Vietnam veteran's weathered hands still shook slightly, not from age, but from the weight of 30 years spent searching for answers that seemed buried deeper than his son's empty grave. Joe's daily ritual never changed. Every sunrise found him standing at the kitchen window of his failing farmhouse, coffee growing cold in his arthritic grip, staring toward the tree line where Tobias had disappeared on a crisp October morning in 1993. The 200 acres that had been in his family for generations were mortgaged to the hilt, medical bills from his late wife Sarah's cancer treatment having consumed their life savings, but Joe couldn't bring himself to sell. Not when Tobias might still come walking out of those woods, camera around his neck, that crooked smile lighting up his face like it had when he was 8 years old. "The mountain speaks to those who listen," Joe's grandfather had always said, and lately Joe swore he could hear whispers in the wind. Dr. Mary Strongbear understood that kind of listening. At 45, the Cherokee Seminole veterinarian carried her own ghosts, the phantom laughter of 8-year-old Emma, whose life had been cut short by a drunk driver 5 years ago. Mary's marriage hadn't survived the grief. Her ex-husband couldn't understand why she talked to the trees or why she'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain she'd heard Emma calling her name. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but Mary knew the truth was simpler and more painful. Some wounds cut too deep for love alone to heal. Joe had saved Mary from the foster system when she was 12, after her mother died and no relatives could be found. He'd taught her that healing came from the earth, that animals were messengers from the spirit world, and that family wasn't always about blood. Now she ran a small wildlife clinic in Gatlinburg, treating everything from injured hawks to orphaned bear cubs, finding in their pain a reflection of her own. William "Billy" Thornfield was the missing piece of their fractured family puzzle. At 32, Tobias's son had inherited his father's eye for photography, but none of his connection to Cherokee traditions. Raised by his grandmother after Tobias disappeared, Billy felt like a stranger in his own heritage. He spoke no Cherokee, knew none of the old stories, and until recently had been too proud to admit he needed the family he'd pushed away. The layoffs at National Geographic had humbled him. Now Billy worked freelance assignments, desperately trying to earn enough to pay lawyers in his custody battle for 6-year-old Tommy. His ex-wife claimed he was unstable. Too much time alone in the wilderness, too obsessed with finding answers about a grandfather he'd never really known. But this morning, something had drawn Billy deeper into the Cherokee forest than he'd ever ventured before. His camera felt heavy in his hands, and he couldn't shake the feeling that today, finally, the mountains were ready to give up their secrets. Billy's boots crunched softly on the carpet of fallen leaves as he made his way deeper into the Cherokee National Forest than any trail map suggested was safe. The assignment from the Nature Conservancy was supposed to be routine, document wildlife patterns near the old growth sections for their annual report. But something had pulled him off the marked paths, a feeling he couldn't quite name that made his Cherokee blood sing in ways he'd never experienced before. The forest felt different here, older somehow. Ancient oaks stretched their gnarled branches toward a sky that seemed both welcoming and watchful. Billy had been walking for 2 hours when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, not the rustle of small creatures or the call of morning birds, but something deeper, a labored breathing that spoke of pain. That's when he saw the bear. Billy froze, his photographer's instincts warring with basic survival sense. The grizzly was massive, easily 800 pounds, its dark fur matted and damp from the morning dew. But it wasn't moving. It lay on its side near the creek bank, one enormous paw twitching occasionally, its barrel chest rising and falling in shallow, deliberate breaths. For 30 seconds, neither moved. Billy slowly raised his camera, the telephoto lens bringing the bear's face into sharp focus. What he saw there made his hands tremble. The bear's eyes weren't wild or afraid. They were intelligent, almost human in their depth, and they seemed to be looking directly at him. More disturbing still, something metallic glinted between the bear's slightly parted jaws, catching the filtered sunlight like broken glass. Billy's finger found the radio clipped to his belt. The Cherokee Forest Service dispatcher sounded skeptical until Billy mentioned the location. "That's near the old medicine circle," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "We'll contact Dr. Strongbear." "Don't approach the animal, and whatever you do, don't leave the area." 45 minutes later, Mary's veterinary truck came bouncing down the fire road, followed by Joe's ancient pickup. Billy watched his grandfather climb out slowly, one hand pressed to his chest, the other gripping a walking stick carved with Cherokee symbols Billy had never bothered to learn the meaning of. "This is sacred ground," Joe said quietly as he approached, his weathered face grave. "The old ones held ceremonies here for generations. If the bear chose this place to—" He paused, studying the massive animal with eyes that had seen too much. "This isn't coincidence, Billy. The mountain doesn't give up its secrets by accident." Mary was already unpacking her equipment, her movements efficient despite the tremor in her hands that Billy had noticed getting worse over the past few months. She'd lost so much weight since Emma's death that her veterinary scrubs hung loose on her frame. But when she worked with animals, something in her seemed to come alive again. "He's conscious, but non-responsive," Mary murmured after her initial examination. "Heart rate's elevated, breathing's labored, but he's not showing signs of aggression or fear. That's unusual for a wild grizzly." She prepared a mild sedative. "I need to get a closer look without risking anyone's safety." The tranquilizer took effect quickly, and Mary began her examination in earnest. What she found made her step back, her face pale. "Joe, Billy, you need to see this." Her voice carried a weight that made both men approach despite their instincts. The bear's abdomen was distended, clearly containing something that shouldn't be there. Mary's portable ultrasound unit, powered by her truck's battery, revealed shapes that defied explanation. "There are multiple foreign objects in his stomach," she said, her professional composure cracking. "Metallic items, what looks like fabric, maybe leather. And something else. Something organic." Joe knelt beside the sedated bear and placed his weathered hand on its massive head. For a moment, Billy could have sworn he saw recognition flicker in the animal's half-closed eyes. "I know you," Joe whispered in Cherokee, words Billy couldn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. You've been waiting for us, haven't you? Mary's equipment revealed more disturbing details. The bear wore a radio collar, but it wasn't from any current wildlife program. The serial number, when Billy looked it up on his phone, traced back to a company called Kellner Environmental Research, a firm that had operated briefly in the early 1990s before mysteriously shutting down. Kellner, Joe repeated, his face darkening. I remember that name from Tobias's papers. He mentioned them in his last few letters before. He couldn't finish the sentence, but Billy understood. Before his father vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a grief that had consumed their family for 3 decades. Mary was preparing for emergency surgery when her examination revealed something that made her gasp audibly. Carefully, she extracted a small object from the bear's mouth, an old Cherokee turquoise medicine necklace, its leather cord darkened with age and moisture. Joe's walking stick clattered to the ground. Sarah made that for Tobias on his 18th birthday, he whispered, his voice breaking. He was wearing it the day he disappeared. The implications hit Billy like a physical blow. His father hadn't simply vanished in some hiking accident. This bear had been carrying evidence that someone had tried very hard to hide. Billy's camera had been recording continuously, and as he reviewed the footage, he noticed something else. In the background audio, barely audible beneath the forest sounds, the bear had been making vocalizations that didn't sound entirely animal. There was a rhythm to them, almost like speech patterns, as if the creature was trying to communicate something desperately important. Mary's hands shook as she prepared the surgical instruments. I have to operate. Whatever's inside him is causing internal bleeding, and if we don't act now... She looked at Joe, whose face had gone gray. But Joe, you need to know. If there's more evidence inside this bear, more things that belong to Tobias, we're not just talking about a wildlife emergency anymore. We're talking about a crime scene that's been hidden for 30 years. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as Mary made the first incision. Inside the veterinary truck, her equipment beeped steadily, monitoring the bear's vital signs. Joe sat heavily on a fallen log, clutching Tobias's necklace, while Billy continued photographing everything with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that this moment might be their only chance at truth. As Mary's scalpel revealed the contents of the bear's stomach, none of them were prepared for what they would find. Because sometimes the wilderness keeps our deepest secrets safe, and sometimes those secrets are worth killing for, even 30 years later. The sterile smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the metallic tang of blood as Mary's gloved hands worked inside the bear's opened abdomen. Her portable surgical lights cast harsh shadows across the makeshift operating table she'd created using the tailgate of her veterinary truck. What she extracted first made her step backwards so quickly she nearly dropped the evidence bag. Human dental remains. A gold filling glinted in the afternoon sunlight, the kind of dental work that had been common in the early 1990s. Mary's breath came in short gasps as she carefully placed the teeth into a sterile container, her mind racing with implications she wasn't ready to face. Mary? Joe's voice was barely a whisper. He'd been silent for the past 20 minutes, clutching Tobias's turquoise necklace against his chest like a talisman. What is it? But Mary couldn't answer yet. Her hands were shaking too badly as she extracted the next item, a leather journal wrapped in what appeared to be a waterproof hunting pouch. The leather was darkened with age and stomach acid, but the plastic protection had kept the contents readable. Behind that, her fingers found something else, a 35mm film canister, the kind photographers used before digital cameras became standard. "Billy?" Mary called, her voice strained. "You need to see this." Billy approached with his camera still recording, documenting everything with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. The journal's cover bore the initials TW carved into the leather, Tobias Whitehorse. Inside, the pages were filled with his father's careful handwriting, dates ranging from September to October 1993. Joe's face went ashen as Billy read the first entry aloud. September 15th, 1993. The water samples from Crying Creek are showing contamination levels that don't match any natural source. Something's been dumped upstream, something that's killing everything it touches. Found 3 dead fish this morning, and the bear family that usually drinks here hasn't been seen in weeks. The entries continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Tobias had been conducting an environmental survey, but he discovered something far worse than routine pollution. Someone had been using the Cherokee sacred lands as a dumping ground for industrial waste, possibly radioactive material based on his descriptions of the animal's symptoms. October 10th, 1993. Billy continued reading, his voice growing stronger despite the tremor in his hands. Followed the contamination trail to its source today. Found barrels buried near the old uranium mine shaft, all marked with Kellner Environmental Research logos, but this isn't cleanup, this is deliberate dumping. The company is using our sacred ground as their private waste disposal site. Joe's walking stick clattered to the ground as he pressed both hands to his chest. His breathing had become labored, the stress of the discovery triggering the heart condition his doctors had been warning him about for years. "I should have listened," he gasped. "Tobias tried to tell me something was wrong, but I thought he was just being dramatic about environmental issues like all the young activists." Mary abandoned her surgical position to check Joe's pulse. It was rapid and irregular, dangerous for a man his age with his medical history. "Billy, call 911. We need to get him to a hospital." "No," Joe said firmly, though his voice was weak. "Not until we know the truth. Not until we finish what Tobias started." Billy continued reading from the journal, his father's words painting a picture of corporate malfeasance that had poisoned their land and possibly caused the cancer that killed his grandmother, Sarah. The final entry was dated October 12, 1993, the day before Tobias disappeared. "Going to confront KER tomorrow with the evidence. If something happens to me, follow the bear trails to the old uranium mine. The mother bear knows she's been trying to lead people away from the contaminated areas. She's protecting her cubs, but she's also protecting us. I've been feeding her family, and I think she understands I'm trying to help." The implications hit them like a physical blow. This bear, the same bear lying sedated before them, had been part of Tobias's investigation 30 years ago. The evidence in its stomach wasn't accidental. It had been deliberately preserved, carried for 3 decades like a living time capsule. Mary returned to her examination of the bear, her movements now urgent. She found more items, soil samples in small plastic bags, each labeled in Tobias's handwriting with GPS coordinates, water samples that had somehow been preserved in sealed glass vials, and at the very bottom of the stomach cavity, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, a manila envelope containing photographs. Billy's hands shook as he carefully extracted the film from the canister and held it up to the light. Even without development, he could make out shadowy figures in the negatives, men in hazmat suits dumping barrels, license plates, faces that might be identifiable once properly processed. "My God," Mary whispered, "this bear has been carrying evidence of a federal crime for 30 years. But as they absorbed this revelation, Billy's cell phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. He answered on speaker, and a gravelly male voice filled the air around them. "I know what you found," the voice said without preamble, "and I know who you are, Billy Thornfield, just like I knew your father 30 years ago." The forest around them seemed to grow quieter, as if even the birds sensed the danger in that voice. Joe's breathing became even more labored, his face pale as recognition dawned. "Who is this?" Billy demanded, but his grandfather was already shaking his head. Marcus Kellner, Joe whispered. Tobias mentioned him in his letters, the CEO of Kellner Environmental Research. The voice on the phone chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. That's right, old man, though I'm surprised you remember. Your son certainly didn't see me coming that October night when he decided to play environmental hero. Mary stepped closer to the phone, her veterinary training making her acutely aware of the bear's vital signs. The animal's heart rate had increased dramatically, as if it recognized the voice coming through the speaker. "You killed Tobias," Billy said, stating it as fact rather than question. "Your father was warned to stop digging around where he didn't belong. Cherokee land, federal contracts, national security interests. There were bigger things at play than one idealistic young man could understand, but he wouldn't listen." Joe struggled to his feet, his hand pressed firmly against his chest. "Where is my son's body?" "That's the beauty of it," Marcus replied. "There is no body. At least not in any form that would be recognizable after 30 years in the elements. Though I have to admit, I'm impressed that damn bear managed to preserve the evidence this long. We've been tracking it for years, waiting for it to die naturally, so we could retrieve what it swallowed." The revelation that they'd been under surveillance sent chills through the group. Billy looked around the forest with new eyes, wondering how many unseen watchers might be observing them at this very moment. "But now you've forced my hand," Marcus continued. "The bear was supposed to be a closed chapter, a secret buried with the evidence. Instead, you've turned it into a crime scene." Mary's equipment began beeping urgently. The bear's vital signs were becoming erratic, whether from the stress of the surgery or some other factor she couldn't tell, but there was something else. The animal's eyes had opened and were tracking toward the phone, almost as if it recognized the voice and was reacting with fear or anger. "The difference between your father and you," Marcus said, his tone turning deadly serious, "is that I learned from my mistakes 30 years ago. Tobias died alone in the woods where nobody could hear him scream. But you three, you're going to have company." The line went dead, leaving them in a silence that felt pregnant with threat. Billy immediately tried calling 911 but found he had no signal, something that had been working perfectly just minutes before. Joe collapsed onto the fallen log, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Boys," he whispered, reverting to Cherokee as stress overwhelmed his English. "The bear? Ask the bear what happened to Tobias." As if responding to his words, the sedated grizzly opened its eyes fully for the first time and fixed its gaze directly on Joe's face. What passed between them seemed to transcend species, a moment of understanding that chilled Billy to his core. Because sometimes the wilderness keeps our deepest secrets safe, and sometimes those secrets are too dangerous to stay buried. The Cherokee National Forest had never felt more like a trap than it did in the moments following Marcus Kellner's phone call. Billy's hands moved frantically across his cell phone, trying every emergency number he could think of, but the device showed no signal bars, a digital silence that felt as ominous as the growing shadows between the trees. Mary worked with desperate efficiency to stabilize the bear, whose vital signs had become increasingly erratic since hearing Marcus's voice. The animal's eyes remained open now, tracking their movements with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Every few minutes, it would make a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like an attempt at communication that none of them could understand. "We need to move," Mary said, checking her watch. "Joe's heart condition is getting worse, and this bear needs proper surgical facilities if it's going to survive." She looked at the evidence they'd extracted, Tobias's journal, the photographs, the soil samples, and made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. "Billy, help me load everything into the truck. We're taking all of this to the tribal police." But Joe remained seated on the fallen log, his weathered face pale and his breathing shallow. "No," he said quietly. "We can't leave. Not yet." "Grandfather, we have to," Billy insisted, moving to help Joe stand. "You heard Marcus. He's coming for us." Joe's hand closed around Tobias's turquoise necklace, and his eyes took on the distant look Billy remembered from childhood. The expression his grandfather wore when he was listening to voices only he could hear. "The bear is trying to tell us something. Something about Tobias." Mary paused in her packing. Despite her scientific training, 33 years of living with Cherokee beliefs ran deeper than medical school. "What kind of something?" "Look at its eyes," Joe whispered. "Really look." They did, and what they saw made Billy's camera slip from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The bear's gaze wasn't random or unfocused. It was looking directly at Joe with an expression that could only be described as grief. The same expression Billy had seen in his grandfather's eyes every morning for 30 years. Mary's veterinary training warred with her Cherokee heritage as she approached the sedated animal. "In Cherokee tradition," she said slowly, "animals can carry messages from those who've passed. My grandmother always said that bears were special. They could hold on to memories longer than any other creature." The bear made that rumbling sound again, and this time Billy could swear there was a pattern to it, almost like syllables. His grandfather heard it too, because Joe's eyes widened and he struggled to his feet. "Tobias," Joe whispered. "It's trying to say Tobias." Before anyone could stop him, Joe approached the bear and placed his hand on its massive head. The animal's eyes closed briefly, then opened again, and this time the sound it made was unmistakably human-like, a approximation of Dad that made Joe's knees buckle. "This is impossible," Mary breathed, but her hands were shaking as she said it. "Bears can't, they don't—" "This bear knew my son," Joe said with absolute certainty. "It was there when Tobias died. It saw what happened." Billy had been recording everything, his photographer's instincts taking over even as his rational mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. Through his camera lens, he watched his grandfather communicate with a wild animal in ways that defied scientific explanation, yet felt completely natural in the ancient forest where Cherokee ceremonies had been performed for generations. "If it saw what happened to Tobias," Billy said slowly, "then it might know where—" The sound of vehicles approaching cut him off. Multiple engines, growing closer by the minute. Mary began frantically packing her equipment while Billy helped Joe toward the truck, but the old man resisted. "The bear," Joe insisted. "We can't leave the bear." "It weighs 800 pounds, Joe," Mary said desperately. "We can't transport it in my truck." But the bear was already struggling to stand, fighting off the effects of the sedative with a determination that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. It rose unsteadily to its feet, swaying but upright, and began walking slowly toward the deeper forest. "It wants us to follow," Joe said. "We can't follow a sedated grizzly bear into the woods while armed men are hunting us," Mary protested, even as she found herself gathering the evidence bags and following Joe, who was already pursuing the bear despite his heart condition. Billy grabbed his camera and backpack, torn between protecting his grandfather and documenting what might be the most important story of his career. The bear moved slowly but purposefully, pausing every few steps to look back and ensure they were following. The vehicles were closer now. Billy could hear car doors slamming and voices shouting orders. Men were spreading out through the forest, their voices carrying the authority of people accustomed to being obeyed, but they were following the fire road, expecting their quarry to attempt escape by vehicle. Instead, the bear led them along an ancient deer trail that wound deeper into the Cherokee National Forest, toward terrain that few outsiders knew existed. Joe moved with surprising strength for a man having heart problems, as if the proximity to Cherokee sacred ground was lending him energy he shouldn't have possessed. "Where are we going?" Mary asked, her veterinary bag bouncing against her hip as they climbed steadily upward. "The old uranium mine," Joe replied without hesitation, "where Tobias said to look." The bear paused at a natural overlook and turned to face them, its massive head tilted as if listening to something they couldn't hear. In the distance, Billy could see flashlight beams sweeping through the trees they'd just left. The searchers were thorough and professional, but they were looking in the wrong direction. "How do you know where we're going?" Billy asked his grandfather. Joe touched the turquoise necklace still clutched in his left hand. "Because I should have come here 30 years ago when Tobias first asked me to. I should have listened when he said something was wrong with the water, wrong with the animals. I thought he was just being young and passionate about environmental causes. But he was trying to protect our people." The bear resumed walking, leading them along a ridge that Billy realized offered perfect concealment from the search below. For an animal that should barely be conscious, it moved with remarkable tactical awareness. Mary's scientific mind struggled with what she was witnessing, but her Cherokee heart understood. "In the old stories," she said quietly as they walked, "bears were messengers between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Grandmother used to say they could carry souls who weren't ready to pass on." "You think Tobias's spirit is—" Billy began. "I think," Joe interrupted, "that love doesn't die just because the body does. And I think my son found a way to preserve the truth, even if it took 30 years to reveal it." They climbed for another 20 minutes, the bear setting a pace that challenged their endurance but remained within their capabilities. Joe's breathing was labored, but his determination seemed to override his physical limitations. Billy documented everything, understanding instinctively that this footage might be the only way to preserve what was happening. The old uranium mine appeared suddenly, hidden behind a screen of mountain laurel that made it nearly invisible from any direction. The entrance was partially collapsed, but recent disturbance in the soil suggested it had been accessed within the past few months. The bear stopped at the mine entrance and sat down heavily, the sedative finally overwhelming its determination. But its eyes remained fixed on Joe, and the rumbling sounds it made seemed to convey urgency. "There's something inside," Joe said. "Something Tobias wanted us to find." Mary checked her watch. They'd been walking for 45 minutes, and Joe's color was getting worse. "We need to get you medical attention soon," she warned. "After we finish this," Joe replied stubbornly. "Tobias waited 30 years. I can wait a little longer." Billy aimed his camera at the mine entrance, adjusting for the low light conditions. What he saw through the telephoto lens made him lower the camera and look again with his naked eyes. "There's light coming from inside," he said. "Artificial light." The implications were chilling. Someone had been using this mine recently, and given Marcus Kellner's phone call, they all knew who that someone was likely to be. The bear made another rumbling sound, this one tinged with what could only be described as warning. It was looking not at the mine, but back down the trail they'd just climbed. Flashlight beams were visible in the distance, moving systematically up the ridge. Marcus's men had found their trail. "We're trapped," Mary said, looking between the approaching searchers and the mine entrance. "They'll find us here." But Joe was already moving toward the mine, his arthritic hands gripping rocks for support as he navigated the loose scree around the entrance. "Then we go inside," he said. "We finish what Tobias started." The bear struggled to its feet one more time and followed Joe toward the dark opening, leaving Billy and Mary with an impossible choice: flee into the forest and abandon Joe to his quest, or follow a dying man and a sedated grizzly bear into an abandoned uranium mine while armed men hunted them through the Cherokee National Forest. Billy shouldered his camera and started after his grandfather. Some stories, he realized, were worth dying for. Mary grabbed her medical bag and the evidence they'd extracted from the bear's stomach. "Emma," she whispered to the memory of her daughter, "if you're watching over me, now would be a good time to help." The mine entrance swallowed them into darkness just as the first flashlight beam swept across the spot where they'd been standing moments before. The darkness inside the uranium mine was absolute, a blackness so complete that Billy felt as though he'd been swallowed by the earth itself. The air was stale and metallic, carrying the scent of rust and something else, something chemical that made his eyes water. Behind them, the entrance glowed faintly with the last traces of daylight, but ahead lay only the unknown. Mary's small LED flashlight cut through the darkness like a blade, revealing rough-hewn walls that glistened with moisture and decades of mineral deposits. The bear moved ahead of them with surprising confidence for an animal that should barely be conscious, its massive paws finding purchase on the uneven stone floor as if it had walked this path many times before. "Stay close," Joe whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "These old mines can have shafts that drop hundreds of feet." But as they moved deeper into the tunnel, Billy realized this wasn't an abandoned mine at all. Someone had been maintaining it. Battery-powered LED strips lined the walls at regular intervals, providing just enough illumination to navigate safely. Fresh tire tracks were pressed into the dirt floor, and the air circulation was far better than it should have been in a sealed mine. "This is an active operation," Mary breathed, her veterinary training making her acutely aware of environmental hazards. "Someone's been using this place regularly." The bear stopped suddenly, its massive head turning toward a side passage that branched off the main tunnel. The rumbling sound it made was different now, lower, more urgent, tinged with what Billy could only interpret as sorrow. Joe understood immediately. "That's where it happened," he said quietly. "That's where Tobias died." The side passage was narrower than the main tunnel, forcing them to walk single file. Billy's camera captured everything automatically, the low-light sensors adjusting to reveal details that his naked eyes couldn't see. What the viewfinder showed him made his blood run cold. Scattered along the passage floor were the remnants of old camping equipment, a sleeping bag so deteriorated it was barely recognizable, the rusted frame of a backpack, and fragments of what had once been photographic equipment. But it was the pile of stones at the end of the passage that made Joe collapse against the wall, his breathing becoming ragged. "The bear buried him," Joe whispered. "My son's been here all along, and this bear has been standing guard over his grave for 30 years. Mary's flashlight revealed scratches in the stone walls, claw marks that spoke of an animal's desperate attempt to create a memorial for someone it had cared about. The bear approached the stone cairn and lay down beside it, its massive head resting on its paws in a posture of eternal vigil. But their moment of discovery was shattered by the sound of voices echoing from the main tunnel. Marcus's men had found the mine entrance and were making their way inside. The LED strips that had seemed like a convenience now became a liability, illuminating their position for anyone following. "There's another way out," Joe said suddenly, his voice gaining strength from some inner reserve. "Tobias mentioned it in his journal. The mine connects to a natural cave system that emerges near the creek." Billy helped his grandfather to his feet, while Mary gathered soil samples from around the stone cairn, her scientific mind insisting on collecting evidence even in their desperate circumstances. The bear struggled to stand, reluctant to leave the grave it had protected for 3 decades. "Come on," Billy urged the animal, feeling ridiculous for talking to a wild grizzly but somehow certain it understood. "You've done your job. You kept his secret safe. Now help us finish what he started." The deeper tunnels were a maze of branching passages, some natural caves that predated the mining operation, others clearly excavated by human hands. Joe moved with surprising certainty, as if his Cherokee heritage was providing navigation that transcended conscious memory. "The water sounds different here," Mary observed, and she was right. Instead of the steady drip of seepage, they could hear the rushing sound of flowing water, a lot of it. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast natural cavern illuminated by shafts of sunlight streaming through openings in the ceiling far above. But what dominated the space was a massive underground lake, its surface mirror-smooth and reflecting the limestone formations that hung like frozen waterfalls from the cavern roof. "Sacred water," Joe breathed. "This is one of the old ceremony caves. Our ancestors used to come here for purification rituals." But the beauty of the natural cathedral was marred by obvious signs of industrial contamination. Metal drums were stacked along one wall, many of them corroded and leaking their contents into the pristine water. The smell was overwhelming, chemicals and decay that made their eyes burn. Billy's camera documented everything, his photographer's eye capturing not just the environmental destruction, but the profound sacrilege it represented. This wasn't just illegal dumping, it was the deliberate desecration of Cherokee sacred space. The bear moved to the water's edge and began making sounds Billy had never heard from any animal, a complex series of vocalizations that almost sounded like speech. Mary approached slowly, her veterinary instincts warring with her Cherokee beliefs. "It's trying to tell us something," she said. "Something important." Joe joined them at the water's edge, and the moment his weathered hand touched the contaminated surface, his face went white. "This is what killed Sarah," he said with absolute certainty. "The cancer, the other illnesses in our community. It all traces back to this water. Marcus has been poisoning us for decades." The sound of boots on stone echoed from the tunnel they'd just exited. Their pursuers were getting closer, and the cavern offered no obvious escape routes. But the bear had moved to a different section of the cave wall, where what looked like a natural rock formation revealed itself under closer inspection to be a camouflaged opening. "Tobias showed me this place once when I was very young," Joe said, memory flooding back. "Before the mining, before the contamination. He used to bring me here to teach me about our heritage." Billy realized his grandfather was talking about his own father, Tobias's grandfather, the man who had passed down the Cherokee traditions that connected their family to this land. The generational threads were coming together in ways that transcended coincidence. The hidden passage led upward through natural limestone formations that seemed to have been carved by water over millions of years. The bear moved ahead of them again, its massive form somehow navigating spaces that seemed too small for its bulk. Behind them, the voices were getting closer. Flashlight beams probed the darkness of the main cavern, and Billy could hear Marcus Kellner's voice directing the search with military precision. "They can't have gone far," Marcus was saying. "Secure all the evidence, and if you find them, make it look like an accident. Bear attack, cave-in, whatever works." Mary's grip tightened on the evidence bags containing Tobias's journal and the photographs that could expose 30 years of environmental crimes. "We have to get this information to the authorities," she whispered. "First, we have to survive," Billy replied, helping Joe navigate a particularly treacherous section where the passage narrowed to barely shoulder width. The bear's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated as they climbed. It kept looking back at them, its vocalizations taking on an urgent quality that suggested they were running out of time. But time for what? Billy couldn't say. The passage emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking the sacred cavern from a height of perhaps 50 feet. Below them, flashlights swept the contaminated lake, while men in tactical gear secured the area. Marcus Kellner stood in the center of it all, his silver hair gleaming in the LED illumination as he directed the operation. "There," Joe pointed to a section of the cavern wall where fresh scratches in the stone marked recent excavation. "They're expanding the operation. They're going to turn the entire sacred cave system into a dump site." Billy's camera captured everything: the illegal dumping, the contamination of sacred Cherokee waters, and most importantly, Marcus Kellner's face as he supervised the destruction of irreplaceable natural and cultural heritage. But as Billy focused his telephoto lens on the scene below, Marcus looked up directly at their hiding spot, his eyes locking with Billy's through the camera viewfinder. "There they are," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustic perfection of the natural amphitheater. "Take them alive if possible, but don't let them leave this cave with that evidence." The sound of gunfire echoed through the cavern as bullets sparked off the limestone around their hiding spot. The bear roared, the first truly wild sound it had made since they found it by the creek, and pushed Joe away from the ledge edge just as a bullet shattered the rock where the old man's head had been. Mary pressed herself against the cave wall, clutching the evidence bags to her chest. "There's nowhere to go," she said, her voice tight with fear. But Joe was looking at the bear with an expression of dawning understanding. "You didn't just preserve Tobias's evidence," he said quietly. "You preserved his spirit, his determination to protect our people." The bear moved to the edge of the ledge and looked down at Marcus Kellner, who was directing his men to find a way up to their position. The animal's massive shoulders tensed, and Billy realized with horror what it was planning to do. "No," he whispered. But the bear had already made its decision. With a roar that shook the ancient stones of the sacred cavern, the 800-pound grizzly launched itself from the ledge, its trajectory carrying it directly toward the man who had murdered its friend 30 years ago. The bear's massive body plummeted through the cavern air like a force of nature unleashed, its roar echoing off the limestone walls with the fury of 30 years of patient grief. Billy watched through his camera lens as 800 pounds of righteous anger descended toward Marcus Kellner, who stood frozen in the center of the contaminated sacred lake. Time seemed suspended in that moment. Marcus's men scattered, their tactical training warring with the primal terror of facing an enraged grizzly in an enclosed space. Some raised their weapons, but the bear was moving too fast, its trajectory too unpredictable for accurate shots in the cavern's confusing acoustics. The impact when the bear hit the cavern floor was sickening, not the clean justice Billy had somehow expected, but the wet, terrible sound of bones breaking and flesh tearing. The grizzly's body struck the stone ledge around the contaminated pool before tumbling into the poisoned water with a splash that sent toxic droplets across the cavern walls. Marcus had thrown himself sideways at the last moment, avoiding the bear's claws but not its final act of defiance. The animal's massive paw caught him across the chest, sending him sprawling into the shallow end of the pool where decades of chemical waste had turned the once sacred water into a cocktail of carcinogens. "Jesus Christ!" one of Marcus's men shouted, his voice cracking with shock. "The thing's still moving." The bear was indeed still alive, but barely. Its back was clearly broken from the fall, and dark blood clouded the contaminated water around its massive head. Yet somehow it managed to lift its muzzle above the surface, its eyes seeking the ledge where Joe, Mary, and Billy watched in horror. Joe was sobbing openly now, his weathered hands pressed against his chest as his heart struggled with the emotional trauma. "It's dying because of us," he gasped, "because we brought it here." "No," Mary said fiercely, her veterinary training overriding her fear as she watched the bear's labored breathing. "It's dying because it chose to protect us, just like it chose to protect Tobias's memory for 30 years. Below them, Marcus struggled to his feet in the contaminated water, his expensive clothes soaked with chemicals that would probably require immediate medical attention. His face was a mask of rage and something else. Fear that his carefully constructed empire of environmental crime was finally collapsing. "Finish them!" Marcus screamed at his men, pointing at the ledge. "I don't care what it takes!" But his men were staring at the dying bear with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices. Watching an animal sacrifice itself to protect others was not part of their usual corporate security duties, and several of them had lowered their weapons entirely. "Sir?" one of them said hesitantly. Maybe we should just secure the evidence and leave. The bear's done for, and we can handle the witnesses later when— Now! Marcus shrieked, his composure completely shattered. Kill them now, or I'll find people who will! The loyalty of hired guns apparently had its limits. Two of the men exchanged glances and began backing toward the tunnel entrance, clearly deciding that whatever Marcus was paying them wasn't worth committing murder in a sacred Cherokee cave while a dying grizzly bear watched their every move. But three others raised their weapons, their training overcoming their qualms. Billy instinctively pushed Mary and Joe back from the ledge edge as bullets sparked off the limestone around them, filling the air with stinging rock chips and the acrid smell of gunpowder. That's when they heard the sound that changed everything, a voice calling from the tunnel entrance, amplified by the natural acoustics of the cavern into something that seemed to come from the earth itself. Federal agents! Everyone drop your weapons and step away from the water! The voice was followed by the distinctive red and blue flashing of emergency lights, their colors painting the cavern walls in alternating patterns that transformed the ancient sacred space into something from a nightmare. But to Billy, those lights looked like salvation. How did they find us? Mary whispered, hardly daring to hope. Billy held up his camera, realization dawning on his face. GPS tracking, he said. My camera's been uploading everything to cloud storage through the emergency satellite network. The Geographic Society probably called the FBI when they saw the footage. Marcus's remaining men were caught in the open, their positions exposed by the very LED lights that had seemed so convenient earlier. The federal agents, there had to be at least a dozen of them based on the number of flashlight beams, had professional tactical equipment and the advantage of cover. This is Agent Sarah Crowfeather, FBI Environmental Crimes Unit, the amplified voice continued. Marcus Kellner, you are under arrest for violations of the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and about 15 other federal statutes. Your operation ends now. The name hit Joe like a physical blow. Crowfeather, he whispered. That's little Sarah, Tommy Crowfeather's daughter. She was in Tobias's class at Cherokee High School. Billy realized the implications immediately. The FBI hadn't just stumbled onto this case. They'd been investigating for years, probably decades. Someone in law enforcement had been building a case against Marcus Kellner, waiting for the right moment and the right evidence. Below them, Marcus's men were surrendering one by one, their weapons clattering to the stone floor as federal agents emerged from multiple tunnel entrances. The cavern was being secured with military precision, but all Billy could focus on was the bear. The grizzly's breathing was becoming shallower, its massive chest rising and falling in irregular patterns that Mary recognized from too many veterinary emergencies. The animal was dying, and there was nothing they could do to help it from their position on the ledge. But Marcus wasn't finished. Even as FBI agents closed in around him, he was pulling something from his jacket. Not a weapon, but a small electronic device with a flashing red light. "If I can't have this place," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern, "then nobody can." Joe's face went white with understanding. "Explosives," he gasped. "He's going to bring down the whole cave system." The FBI agents were shouting orders, trying to get a clear shot at Marcus without risking detonation of whatever device he was holding, but Marcus was standing in the middle of the contaminated pool, using the bear's dying body as cover, protected by the very animal that had tried to kill him. 20 seconds, Marcus screamed. 20 seconds and 30 years of Cherokee sacred sites become a permanent toxic waste dump. Let's see your federal government clean up a radioactive cave-in. Billy's photographer instincts took over, his camera capturing Marcus's confession and the detonation device with perfect clarity. Whatever happened next, the evidence would survive even if they didn't. But as Marcus counted down the final seconds, the dying bear made one last effort. With the last of its strength, it lifted its massive head and clamped its jaws around Marcus's wrist. the wrist holding the detonation device. Marcus screamed in pain and terror as the bear's teeth pierced flesh and bone, but the animal's grip was weakening rapidly. Blood from both man and beast mixed in the contaminated water as they struggled for control of the device that could destroy one of the most sacred places in Cherokee culture. 8, 7, 6. Marcus continued counting despite the agony, his finger hovering over the detonation button. Agent Crow Feather's voice cut through the chaos one final time. "Snipers, you are authorized to take the shot." The sound of the rifle shot was sharp and final in the confined space of the cavern. Marcus Kellner's body jerked once and then went still, the detonation device tumbling from his nerveless fingers to sink beneath the surface of the poisoned water. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sound was the bear's labored breathing, growing weaker with each passing moment. Joe struggled to his feet despite his heart condition, his Cherokee heritage demanding that he bear witness to the animal's final moments. "Thank you," Joe whispered in Cherokee, his words carrying across the water to where the grizzly lay dying. "Thank you for keeping my son's memory safe. Thank you for bringing us the truth." The bear's eyes found Joe's face across the cavern, and for just a moment, Billy could swear he saw recognition there, not just animal awareness, but something deeper, something that transcended the boundary between species and touched the realm of the sacred. Then the great head settled into the contaminated water for the last time, and the bear that had carried Tobias Whitehorse's secrets for 30 years finally laid down its burden. The silence in the sacred cavern was profound, broken only by the sound of Joe Whitehorse weeping for his son, his people, and the magnificent creature that had loved them both enough to die protecting their truth. The sacred cavern fell into a silence so profound that Billy could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the limestone walls. The bear's massive body floated motionless in the contaminated water, its dark fur fanned out like a shroud across the surface of what had once been Cherokee ceremonial pools. Agent Sarah Crow. Feather's voice over the tactical radio seemed to come from another world as she coordinated the federal response to 30 years of environmental crimes. But Joe Whitehorse wasn't listening to radio chatter or FBI protocols. The old Cherokee elder was staring at the water where Marcus Kellner's body had disappeared beneath the surface, his weathered face etched with an expression that transcended grief and touched something deeper, a recognition that justice had been served, but at a cost that would haunt him for whatever time he had left. "Grandfather," Billy said softly, his camera lowered for the first time since they'd entered the forest that morning. "We need to get you to a hospital. Your heart—" "My heart is fine," Joe interrupted, though his hand remained pressed to his chest and his breathing was clearly labored. "It's my soul that's damaged. 30 years, Billy. 30 years I let that man poison our water, poison our people, while Tobias's bones lay unburied and his spirit couldn't rest." Mary approached carefully, her veterinary bag in one hand and the plastic evidence containers in the other. The photographs and documents they'd extracted from the bear's stomach were still intact, protected by the animal's sacrifice in ways that seemed to transcend mere coincidence. "Joe," she said gently, "what happened here tonight? It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" Joe's voice carried the weight of a lifetime of regret. "Tobias tried to tell me something was wrong. The water tasted different, the animals were acting strange, the cancer rates in our community were climbing. But I was too proud, too set in my ways to listen to my own son." Federal agents were rappelling down into the cavern now, their equipment and expertise turning the sacred space into a crime scene. Billy watched them work with professional efficiency, documenting everything, collecting evidence, preparing to transform this place into another line item in a federal prosecution. But Agent Crowfeather approached their position on the ledge with something that looked like reverence. She was younger than Billy had expected, maybe 35, with the strong features of Cherokee heritage and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's capacity for environmental destruction. "Mr. Whitehorse," she said, addressing Joe with the respect due to an elder. "I'm Sarah Crowfeather. My grandfather was Tommy Crowfeather. He used to tell me stories about your family, about the old ways." Joe's eyes focused on her face with effort. "Little Sarah, you were in Tobias's class?" "Yes, sir. He used to walk me home from school sometimes when my parents were working late. He was a good man, Mr. Whitehorse. And what he started here, what you finished tonight, it's going to save lives." Billy found his voice. "How long have you been investigating Kellner?" Agent Crowfeather's expression darkened. "Officially, 3 years since we started getting reports about cancer clusters in Cherokee communities. Unofficially, I've been collecting information about Marcus Kellner since I was a rookie agent 15 years ago. My grandmother died of ovarian cancer when I was in college. Cancer that never should have happened to a woman who lived the traditional ways and ate food from land that was supposed to be protected." Mary stepped forward, offering the evidence bags they'd preserved. Tobias's journal documents the contamination going back to 1993, and the photographs will be enough to shut down every illegal operation Kellner Industries has been running across 6 states, Agent Crowfeather finished. "We've been building a case, but we needed proof of the original contamination. What that bear preserved, what your son preserved, Mr. Whitehorse, it's the keystone that brings down the entire criminal enterprise." But Joe wasn't listening to talk of prosecutions and federal cases. His attention was fixed on the water below, where the bear's body continued to float in the contaminated pool. "We can't leave him there," he said quietly. "He deserves better than to die in poisoned water." "Sir," Agent Crowfeather said carefully, "the bear is evidence. We'll need to—" "That bear was my son's friend," Joe interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that made the federal agent step back. "He protected Tobias's memory for 30 years, and he died protecting us tonight. Cherokee law says he should be buried with honor, not dissected in some FBI laboratory." Billy watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about environmental crimes or federal jurisdiction. This was about the clash between 2 different ways of seeing the world: the bureaucratic efficiency of federal law enforcement and the spiritual obligations of Cherokee tradition. Agent Crowfeather studied Joe's face for a long moment, then spoke into her radio. "Base, this is Crowfeather. We're going to need tribal liaisons down here, and I want environmental hazmat teams to start water purification procedures immediately. This is a sacred site, and it's going to be treated as such." The response that crackled back over the radio was immediate and bureaucratic. "Agent Crowfeather, you are not authorized to make decisions about evidence handling. The bear remains in federal custody until—" "The bear," Agent Crowfeather said firmly, "died protecting federal officers and civilians from an armed terrorist who was attempting to destroy evidence and contaminate federal waterways. The least we can do is show some respect." Mary's medical training had been keeping her focused on Joe's deteriorating condition, but now she stepped forward with something approaching anger. That animal spent 30 years carrying evidence of environmental genocide in its stomach. It lived on contaminated land, drank poisoned water, and still managed to preserve the truth that will save countless lives. If the FBI wants to perform an autopsy, they can do it with Cherokee spiritual leaders present, and they can return the remains for proper burial. Billy realized he was witnessing something remarkable. 3 generations of Cherokee people standing up to federal authority, not with violence or confrontation, but with the quiet dignity that had allowed their culture to survive centuries of attempted destruction. And apparently, Agent Crowfeather recognized it too. "You're right," she said simply. "All of you. This investigation has always been about more than prosecuting corporate criminals. It's about healing the damage that's been done to the land and the people who depend on it. Joe's breathing had become increasingly labored during the conversation, and Mary's veterinary instincts finally overrode her respect for the moment. "Joe, you're having another cardiac episode. We need to get you out of here now." But Joe was looking at the water again, his expression distant. "I can see him," he said quietly. "Tobias, he's standing next to the bear, and they're both whole again." Billy felt ice in his veins. His grandfather's words carried the tone of someone seeing beyond the physical world, and in Cherokee tradition, that usually meant only one thing. "Don't you dare!" Mary said fiercely, dropping to her knees beside Joe and checking his pulse. "Don't you dare die on me now, Joe Whitehorse. Not when we've finally found the truth, not when we can finally bring Tobias home." Agent Crow Feather was already calling for medical evacuation, her radio crackling with urgent coordination, but Joe's eyes remained fixed on something none of them could see. "Tell Tommy," Joe whispered to Billy, referring to his great-grandson. "Tell him that his grandfather Tobias was a hero. Tell him that the bear was a hero too. And tell him that sometimes the mountains give up their secrets when the people who love them are ready to listen." Mary's training told her that Joe was having a massive coronary event, probably triggered by the stress and physical exertion of the night. But her Cherokee heart heard something else in his words, the sound of a man who had finally found peace after 30 years of searching. "The helicopters are coming," Agent Crow Feather reported. "Medical evac and hazmat teams. We'll have him out of here in 10 minutes. But Billy was watching his grandfather's face, seeing the same expression he'd observed in the bear's eyes just before it died, a recognition of completion, of purpose fulfilled. Joe Whitehorse had spent 3 decades carrying the weight of his son's disappearance, and now, finally, he knew the truth. "Grandfather," Billy said, taking Joe's weathered hand in his own, "Tobias would be proud of you. You didn't give up." "You never gave up." Joe's grip tightened slightly, and his eyes focused on Billy's face with effort. "The pictures," he said urgently. "Make sure the world sees the pictures. Make sure they understand what was lost here and what was saved." Below them, federal agents were carefully retrieving the bear's body from the contaminated water, treating it with a reverence that spoke to Agent Crow Feather's influence over the operation. The sacred cavern that had been desecrated for 30 years was finally going to be cleansed, its waters purified, its role as a Cherokee ceremonial site restored. But the cost had been enormous. Tobias's life, the bear's life, and now possibly Joe's life as well. Billy gripped his camera tighter, understanding that his grandfather was right. The world needed to see what had happened here, needed to understand the price of environmental destruction and the courage of those who fight to preserve what's sacred. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the cavern as the medical team arrived, but Joe Whitehorse's eyes had already closed for the last time, his weathered face peaceful in a way Billy had never seen during his grandfather's long years of searching and grief. 6 months after the sacred cavern was sealed and purified, Billy Thornfield stood at the edge of Crying Creek watching his 6-year-old son Tommy skip stones across water that ran clear and clean for the first time in 30 years. The custody battle was over. His ex-wife had dropped her claims when Billy's National Geographic cover story brought him international recognition and financial stability. But more importantly, Tommy was learning Cherokee words from his great-aunt Mary, who had become the head of the newly established Cherokee Environmental Protection Agency. The farmhouse that had been mortgaged to the breaking point was now paid off, thanks to the federal settlement from the Kellner Industries prosecution. Joe's 200 acres had been expanded into a 1,000-acre preserve, protected in perpetuity as both a wildlife sanctuary and a memorial to the grandfather Tommy would never meet, but whose courage he would grow up understanding. "Dad, look!" Tommy called out, pointing excitedly toward the tree line. "There's a bear!" Billy's heart skipped as he followed his son's pointing finger, but what he saw made him smile instead of reaching for his phone to call wildlife services. A young black bear, probably 3 years old, was drinking from the creek about 50 yards upstream. It showed no fear of their presence, no aggression, just the calm confidence of an animal living in a place where it belonged. "That's probably one of the cubs that were orphaned when the contamination was cleaned up," Mary said, approaching from the memorial stone they'd placed near the spot where the grizzly had first been found. "The rehabilitation program has been releasing them back into clean habitat as fast as we can process them." The memorial itself was simple, a rough granite boulder with a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Tobias Whitehorse and the bear who kept his secrets. They taught us that love transcends death and courage transcends species." Below that, in Cherokee syllabary that Tommy was learning to read, were the words Joe had whispered in his final moments. "The mountain keeps its promises." Agent Sarah Crow. Feather visited regularly, bringing updates on the prosecution that had expanded far beyond Marcus Kellner's operation. 17 other companies had been indicted for environmental crimes, and the Cherokee Nation had been awarded unprecedented sovereignty over environmental protection within their traditional territories. The legal precedent established by Tobias's evidence had strengthened indigenous rights across the country. "Your grandfather would be amazed by this place now," Mary told Tommy as they walked along the restored creek bank. "When I was your age, the water was so polluted that fish couldn't live in it." "Now look." Tommy peered into the clear water where minnows darted between the rocks and crayfish scuttled along the bottom. "Did the bear really carry Grandpa Tobias's messages in his tummy for 30 years? "He did," Billy confirmed, kneeling beside his son, "and that bear taught us something important about loyalty and love. Sometimes we have to carry difficult truths for a long time before we find the right moment to share them." The young bear upstream had finished drinking and was ambling back toward the forest, but it paused at the edge of the trees to look back at them. Billy could have sworn there was something knowing in that glance, as if the animal understood its place in a story that was still being written. Mary had established a small clinic on the preserved land, treating wildlife and conducting research that was helping other communities deal with similar environmental damage. Her work with traumatized animals had also helped her process her own grief over Emma's death, and she'd recently started dating a Cherokee language teacher from the tribal college. "Sometimes," Mary said, watching the bear disappear into the forest, "I think about that grizzly's choice. He could have lived peacefully in the wilderness, keeping his secrets forever, but he chose to trust us with the truth, even though it cost him everything." Billy nodded, thinking about his own choices. He could have stayed in California, fighting for freelance assignments and struggling to pay lawyers. Instead, he'd moved back to Cherokee land, learning the language and traditions he'd rejected as a young man, teaching Tommy about heritage and responsibility. The National Geographic documentary based on his footage had won an Emmy, but more importantly, it had inspired similar investigations across Indian country. Environmental justice was finally being recognized, not just as a legal issue, but as a matter of cultural survival. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, where 4 generations of Whitehorse men had lived and loved and struggled with the land, Tommy slipped his small hand into Billy's. "Dad, do you think Great-Grandpa Joe and Tobias and the bear are all together now?" Billy looked up at the ridge where the old uranium mine had been permanently sealed, where Cherokee prayers were offered daily for the healing of sacred ground. "I think they're exactly where they're supposed to be, son. Watching over this place, making sure it stays protected for your children and your children's children." The evening light filtering through the ancient oaks painted everything in shades of gold and green, and for the first time since Tobias disappeared 30 years ago, the Cherokee National Forest felt like home again. The mountain had indeed kept its promises, and love had found a way to transcend death, one generation at a time. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest sorrows, and sometimes healing takes longer than we ever imagined possible. This story of Joe Whitehorse reminds us that the love between generations never truly dies. It just finds new ways to express itself, whether through a loyal bear protecting secrets for 30 years or a grandfather's final sacrifice ensuring his family's future. For those of us who've lived long enough to bury parents, lose spouses, or watch our children struggle with challenges we can't fix, Joe's journey speaks to something profound. Our pain has purpose, our persistence matters, and the values we pass down can literally save lives decades later. Like Joe, many of us carry guilt about words left unspoken, warnings unheeded, or love unexpressed. But this story teaches us that it's never too late for truth, never too late for healing, and never too late for our families to find their way back to each other. The sacred waters ran clean again because someone refused to give up hope, because love transcended death itself, and because sometimes the wilderness gives up its secrets exactly when we need them most. What family truth or unfinished story are you still carrying that needs to be shared? Have you ever experienced a moment when nature seemed to be trying to tell you something important? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.